So to get some more background information on you,
Sure.
can you talk a little bit about your life before being in the service? So where you grew up and a little bit about your home life.
I was born in New York City and grew up on Long Island after I was about, I guess we moved there when I was about 3. I have one brother, and both of my parents were alive. We lived off and on with assorted grandparents as well, as that happens, or that happened in 1950. I knew I always wanted to be a nurse, and my mother insisted that I go to college. And back in the early 1960s, that was very unusual for nurses because there were still 3-year diploma non-degree programs, as there are now. But she was a very forward-seeing woman, and she would not allow me to go to a diploma program, even though that's what I wanted to do. So I wound up going to a small state university in upstate New York, Plattsburgh, State University of New York at Plattsburgh. We were about 60 miles south of Montreal, so it was way up there. And it was a wonderful nursing program. And by my probably sophomore year, I knew I wanted to do something in the military for a number of reasons. One, I needed the money because we were probably middle class at that time. My dad worked, my mom was at home. We didn't have a whole lot of money, but we didn't want for anything. But college, even back then, was expensive, assuming the times. So I knew I needed some scholarship money. I wanted desperately to get out of New York State. And my dad was in the war, World War II, and I thought it was something I wanted to do as well, to serve my country. The thing that really cinched it, and I'll find it as soon as we've finished just a little bit of conversation, was this beautiful poster that the recruiting command had during that time. I mean, it just dragged at my heart. It was like a soldier looking up at a nurse, and you could see the clouds and the smoke in the background. And she was looking down. Of course, she was gorgeous and had perfect makeup, and her hair, even though it was slightly mussed. And the comment on the recruiting poster was, "The most beautiful girl in the world, an Army nurse." Couldn't let that one pass by. So when I was a junior in college, I enrolled in what was then known as the Army Student Nurse Program, which was a program that the military had during the war in order not only to recruit nurses, because there was a desperate need for them, but also to have them available for a period of time after they started on active duty. So I signed up for 2 years of college and was private first class. And afterwards, I would owe the military 3 years. And in 1967, I know that's before you were born, but in 67, when I first signed up, 1972 seemed like eons. Even in 1969, when I graduated, it seemed like eons. I was a very shy girl in high school. Didn't have very many friends. Played tennis, played the piano, loved both of them. Had some very, very close friends who were a small group, but I didn't have a whole lot of friends. Blossomed in college. Had my first date in college. And but when time came to graduate, I knew where I was going. It was kind of odd. During that time, 1968-69, The Graduate, a movie, was very popular. I don't know if you've seen it or you've heard about it. But the story essentially is about a young man who graduates from college and has no idea what he's going to do. All of my friends and everyone my age just thought it was a wonderful movie. They just so identified with it. I had no idea what they were talking about because I knew what I was going to do. I knew where I was going to go. And that was it. So when I graduated, I went home to Valley Stream, studied up for my nursing boards, which I took in July of 1969. And then in August, even before I had the results from my nursing boards, I was off to basic training. And I got word about 2 months later. My mom called me from New York. By this time I was in Denver. And she said, "You passed," which was great to know. My dad is first-generation American, was first-generation American from Norway. He immigrated when he was about 10, 12, somewhere in there. My mom's parents were first-generation from Lithuania. They had escaped. My grandfather came first, and then my grandmother did. And they met in Pennsylvania. My mom and her 8 siblings grew up on a farm in upstate New York, near a little town called Middleburg. So my family unit was huge. Lots of cousins, lots of aunts and uncles. So every holiday it was this large celebration because my folks were the only ones in her family who had a large enough home, and it was a very small house, but the basement was big. So our house was big enough to have people, many people, for the holidays. Every holiday, Easter, 4th of July, Labor Day, Thanksgiving, Christmas. The house was just filled. And as my older cousins continued to have kids, they got fuller and fuller. So that by the time I graduated and went to Vietnam, there were a lot of family members who came to that goodbye party for Martha.
Do you think that having such a close family, it was hard to leave them behind and go to Vietnam to serve? Or do you think it was their support that helped you go?
It was not hard for me to leave New York. I was ready for the excitement of doing something differently. There's no doubt that I didn't volunteer for Vietnam. I was happy being at Fitzsimmons General Hospital, which was just outside of Denver. And lots of other people had volunteered to go, but I wasn't the least bit interested in going. So when I came down on orders from the Army to go to Vietnam, I only had about a month's notice from the time I received the word to the time I stepped in country. And I called home to tell my folks the day I learned about it, and my mom said, "But the recruiter told me the war would be over by the time you graduated," which in 1967 was, I guess, a good recruitment. Anyway, my family was extraordinarily supportive, even though I was going to Vietnam. They believed in military service. They believed in serving your country. They believed in that kind of sacrifice. My dad was proud. My mom was realistic and scared. And I drove off the day I was ready to go back to take a flight to Travis Air Force Base, which is where I lived. I had a couple of my very close friends, my brother and my mom, standing on the lawn, waving goodbye to me. My dad was at work, and when I forgot something. I had forgotten something. So I drove back, and there was my mother in tears with my friends. So anyway, throughout the entire time I was in Vietnam, my family sent goodies and letters and tapes and pictures and Christmas presents and New Year's presents. And when I was getting ready to go on R&R after having been in Vietnam for 9 months, my mom sent me some Dior bubble bath because it would be the first tub bath I'd be able to take since I had left. Before I left, I went up to Middleburg, New York, to visit some cousins, and one of my biggest luxuries. My cousin was married to a lawyer, and they had this huge swimming pool in their backyard. It was a gorgeous day in June, and I was floating in their pool, looking at the sun, and Dave, who's my cousin's husband, brings me out a drink. So here I am, floating in the pool with a drink in hand, thinking, where will I be in 2 weeks? But, oh, this is lovely now. So they were, yes, very supportive throughout the entire time I was there. My brother was in college at that time, the University of Houston, and I even heard from him.
Do you think that their support helped you get through what you were going through in country?
Oh, it certainly cut down on the loneliness, yes. But the support that really made a difference in country were my colleagues, my nursing colleagues. That, I think it's probably the same in every conflict, combat situation. You really do rely on the people that you're working with. As they would say today, they had my back. I had their back.
So transitioning from your early life and then going to Vietnam, do you have any particular memories from your trip there or your initial reactions to being over there? I
was very much in love with a guy I had met at Fitzsimmons. So instead of going directly to Travis, I flew to Denver, spent a couple of days with him, and then he took me to the airport. Oh God, leaving on a jet plane was playing in the background. It was impossible. Flew from Denver to Travis Air Force Base, to Los Angeles, and then took a bus to Travis Air Force Base. We didn't know what to wear, so we wore a duty uniform, which happened to have a hat, a blouse, a skirt, stockings, high-heeled shoes, a purse, along with my assorted luggage. So that the almost 24-hour journey from California to Benoit, which is the military airport we landed at, was unbelievable. We stopped in Hawaii for an hour to refuel, and that's my only time in Hawaii. I saw Diamond Head. We got back on the plane, and of course by this time, must have been 6 or 7 hours we'd been on the plane. My feet had started to get a little larger in those shoes. And then we flew on to Guam, stopped to refuel again, and we were there for a couple of hours. And there were 5 women on the plane, with the rest fellows who'd been drafted, basically. And as soon as they opened the airplane door, I could feel this heat and humidity just roll on in. I could still feel it. It was just oppressive. Got back on the plane. My feet are bigger now. We flew another several hours and finally landed in Benoit. Exhausted. We had to wait for our bags. And I had both suitcases and a duffel bag. Some friends from college had helped me pack, and I put all my sanitary supplies in the bottom of my bag. So when the bag got off of the aircraft, there were these soldiers who were loading it onto trucks, and I could just see this bag being dragged across the tarmac, and I'm thinking to myself, oh, I hope it doesn't burst, I hope it doesn't burst, because all these Tampaxes would just kind of fly out. We were whisked off to the replacement battalion, where initial assignments were given. I just remember being terribly exhausted, but we couldn't go to bed yet. We had to go through and get all of our jungle stuff, one of which happened to be a pair of boots. I asked for a size 5, which is the size I wore at that time, and the sergeant looked at me like, oh gosh. And he said, I'm sorry, ma'am. Ma'am, they called us all ma'am. Here I was, a little 23-year-old thing, and there he was, this wizened master sergeant. And I said, oh, okay. I'll take the smallest size you have. He said, well, that's an 8.5. I said, okay, I'll just keep my boots. And I still have those boots today. I wore them all through Vietnam, all through my military career, and on the day of my retirement in 1995, I wore them. Going home, I didn't wear heels. I wore flats.
So, what was your reaction to treating your first wounded soldier when you were in Vietnam?
My reaction.
Or how did you handle yourself? Or what was the situation like when you were treating not necessarily first wounded soldier, but just any first person that came into?
I had an orientation before I had an assignment at the 12th, and we rotated through all of the different units. I don't really remember much about the emergency room, except that it was very busy and very noisy. We went from there to a triage area, and I don't really remember much about that at all. The operating room, again, was very loud. It was very clean, though. I mean, a lot of people say there's blood all over the floor, and yeah, there was a lot of blood, and we did amputations and things along those lines. But the operating room nurses were very conscious of infection control and cleanliness, and it really was very, very clean. After each case, they would just get right on cleaning it. I don't really remember a whole lot about the operating room because I was only there a day. But the first case that really struck me was a young man in the intensive care unit. I had been in Vietnam about a week, 7 days, 10 days, maybe something like that. I was still trying to adjust to the time zone change, which was 12, 13 hours, something like that, as well as the heat, the humidity, and the number of hours to work, because we worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And I remember just going to work absolutely exhausted. In the morning, I was on a day shift. Went to work at 7 a.m. and finished at maybe 7 p.m. But this young man had come in from the field. His name was Rick. Oh gosh, I can still see him. He was early 20s. How are we doing here? Doing okay. Early 20s, and he was very sunburned, red hair, lots of freckles, huge, big guy. He had been diagnosed with meningitis and encephalitis, and he was dying, basically. But he had yet not to be put on a respirator. One day, at one point during this day, he had a seizure. And I was caring for him, and as the other nurses and I attempted to help him stay safe and as comfortable as possible during this seizure, I remember laying over the litter and looking up at the clock, and it was noon. I was exhausted, And all of a sudden, the thought hit me, I have 7 more hours to work. I didn't know how I was going to get through the day. But Rick, he must have been a very handsome man. When I looked through his chart, there was a lot of the demographics, next of kin, his wife. He had a very young wife, didn't have any children, and one night shift while I was still working in the emergency room, I sat down and read his chart and thought about his wife. And I got very, very sad for her because I knew she wouldn't see him again, that he would be so unstable, we would not be able to transfer him out of the country. And he would die there in Vietnam. That made me very sad. And although I went over gung-ho about the war, over time I could feel myself changing from someone who was very positive about the reason I was there, about the reason why the United States was there, to being very bitter about why we were there. I never had a day that I didn't feel as if, I always felt, let me put it that way, as if I was at the zenith of my nursing profession. It was incredible experiences, heart-wrenching, funny. But Rick was my first patient that I really, really, really remember. And I remember it with great sadness. I can't remember his last name, so I've not been able to look him up on the wall, which I would have liked to have done. Have no idea what happened, the Vietnam Wall in Washington. I have no idea what happened to him when his wife received the news, how it all went. I just remember that one day and night shift with Rick.
So when it's going into the later parts of the war, like you're mentioning about how you felt about this first patient, as the war went on, did you find it harder to place patients, or did it become more easy?
I was assigned both at the 12th and in Saigon to a Vietnamese ward, which was medicine and surgery and lots of problems. So I was not consistently dealing with GIs from the field. And in a way, I looked upon that as kind of a blessing, because it wasn't a constant for me. I'm not sure how I would have done had it been a constant for me. However, the interactions I had with the GIs, both in the field and those GIs who had come in from the field to work at the hospital at Third Field, or those few GIs that we would get at Third Field before they were shipped back to the States, were wonderful. They knew what they were facing going home. It was not going to be pretty. It was not going to be fun. It was nothing like what you see these days. There are memories that stick with me. There are horrible memories that stick with me. I've done a lot of Vietnam stuff these last 6 weeks. You guys, I've needed to write an article. My husband and I went to a luncheon at Methodist University a week ago. Fort Bragg had this big Heroes Homecoming stuff, 10-day event, and one of the events was at Methodist University luncheon for nurses who had served in Vietnam. I found myself extraordinarily resistant to going, but for a number of reasons I had to go. And to my surprise, it was very moving. And but it also created quite an upheaval. And was tough. Was tough, especially when I remembered some of the last days. the 12th evac, we were all leaving one another, and we had been each other's, tightly knit group, and didn't know where we were going. Some were going north, others were going home. Some of us were going, well, 3 of us went to Third Field. I was the only nurse. There was an ophthalmologist as well as a nurse anesthetist who had, well, I wasn't the only nurse. Lou was also a nurse, but he was in anesthesia. And in a way, I was very disappointed. I wanted to stay out where I knew I would have at least some contact with the GIs. And I was assigned in the Vietnamese ward in Saigon. And I think that's really where my personal perspectives of why we were in Vietnam truly deteriorated and made me very bitter. The politics were astonishing. I had never been exposed like that. I had basically been a pretty sheltered young woman, and not only hadn't seen a lot of trauma, practically no trauma at all, so there was that, but the black market was difficult for me to understand. We treated a lot of Vietnamese in Saigon who were very wealthy. We treated Vietnamese who weren't wealthy. We had a plastic surgeon at Third Field, and he didn't have a whole lot to do, so he wound up doing a lot of cleft lips and palates on the young Vietnamese children. But we, there was a lot of money floating around, a lot of brass floating around, brass as in senior officers floating around. There were many civilians. And I saw the GIs of lesser rank, especially the enlisted personnel, treated very, very poorly by all of these people. We had a Red Cross volunteer from Canada who did a lot of orientation, who did work with us, but she also worked in the orphanages in town. She lived with her family, with her husband and her children, on a street, a beautiful street in Saigon, French villa. But at one end and at the other end there were guards, paid guards, to guard the families that lived there. Her husband was a contractor. They had lots of money. She didn't want for anything. And just before we left, she was talking about how, or just before she left rather, she was talking about how she was so happy to be going home and leaving all of this filth, and how she really didn't like those dirty little slopes. That was a derogatory term that was used to describe the Vietnamese children, as well as the biracial children of American GIs and Vietnamese women. And she had apparently taken a lot of things from our hospital to take to the orphanage, which wouldn't have been a problem, of course, but she never asked. She just assumed that it was her right to do that. When Dick and I were going to Bangkok for R&R, I went down to the embassy and had no trouble getting a passport, because I was an officer and I was a woman, a very young woman, who was a rarity. But Dick, who, although he was a warrant officer, was considered to be an enlisted person, he had a great deal of difficulty getting a passport. They lost his application once or twice. he had to get a certified copy of his birth certificate from his mother back in the States. And we almost didn't make it to Bangkok because of all of the, we used to call it Mickey Mouse, the runaround at the embassy. It was a real eye-opener. The other, it's kind of funny, the other thing, another time, the ophthalmologist that had come down from the 12th of Act with me, am I running on too much? Oh, okay. Who had come down from the 12th with me also didn't have a whole lot of stuff going on. So he did a lot of work with Vietnamese civilians. And one of the civilians happened to be the mother-in-law of a very senior person in the Vietnamese government. And a very, very influential family. And after her cataracts had been removed, can we stop? I need to get a tissue. Thank you. I was saying, the mother-in-law of this influential government person had her cataracts removed, and we were invited to her home for dinner as a thank you. And so I went with Bob, and Dick came along with us. We went to this magnificent French villa in Saigon because the French had been there in the early 1950s. And we walked in, and I sat down on a little chair between two 400-year-old Ming vases. They were part of her family, the wife's family, that had brought them down when they fled from North Vietnam. So that was kind of the introduction. The husband, the son-in-law, pointed to the bar, which was better stocked than any bar I have ever seen in my life, with all high-priced liquor for a drink. And when we sat down to, I think it must have been at least a 12-course, if not a 15-course dinner, there was one woman at the table in this glorious white chiffon evening dress and décolletage way down. My eyes were on the 10 strand pearl necklace, all perfectly matched white pearls. They were just glorious. As well as this huge, probably would rival Kim Kardashian's diamond rock on her left hand. And she noticed me looking at it, and she said, "Oh yes, these are lovely, but this," and she held out her wrist. And on it was this greenish, light greenish bracelet. She said, "This is the most valuable of all." It was a solid piece of jade that had been carved just for her wrist. So, yeah, right. No doubt there was lots of money. She was known as the Diamond Lady of Saigon. She ran a jewelry store. I don't know if her family ever got out. I'm sure they did. They probably bought their way out. So that was really interesting. And then from their house, our evening wasn't done yet. They took us to a nightclub. Okay, so here I am with Dick in civilian clothes in a Vietnamese home without my ID card or my USFK, United States, or US, MACV, Military Command Vietnam, I think that's what it was, without any of my documents. Thinking, holy cow. So we go to this nightclub. As I recall, it was a narrow kind of thing. There were, the booze was flowing like water. The girls were pretty scantily dressed. Dick recalls one of the uncles, who happened to be a Supreme Court judge, leaning over and whispering to him, "Anyone you want. Just say the word, anyone you want." And then we got raided by what was euphemistically known as the white police, the white rats. Or the white mice, rather. The white mice. And they were the Vietnamese civilian police. And I knew I was done for. I mean, I wasn't going home. I was going to ship right to North Vietnam unless I was, drawn and quartered, or something horrible was going to happen. Well, I didn't need to worry, because as one of the white mice approached our table, he noticed all of these governmental VIPs who said to us, "Oh, just get up." So we stood up and followed him out of the nightclub, upstairs, and down the back into private limousines and private taxis. And nothing was ever said. We went from there to the penthouse of a Frenchman that was absolutely glorious. Again, the booze was flowing like water. And one of the things I remember most was that he had this open porch that looked out on the city, and it was just so beautiful. The little lights sparkling. You couldn't see the slums, you couldn't see the tin houses, you couldn't see all of the ugly stuff. But it was really pretty. The sky was pretty, and the weather was lovely, lovely. We got home about 3, maybe 4. I had to go to work at 7. But an unbelievable night. Had it not happened to me, had I not been there, I wouldn't have ever believed it, because it was just so surreal in many ways. And it showed me the harsher side of life, not harsher from a perspective of poverty and filth and difficult times, but the harsher side of life from, you have the money, you buy what you want, and the rest be damned. And that didn't sit well with me. That wasn't how I was raised. That flew in the face of everything I thought I was there in Vietnam for. Did I have a great time that night? Oh, yeah, I did. And it took me a while to reflect on what I had seen. Those 6 months in Saigon were very political. The 6 months that I had at the 12th Evac, as I mentioned to you both, were blood and guts. And I think I prefer the blood and guts to the politics any day. I came home, glad to be home, sorry to be missing my friends still back in the war, because it continued on until the debacle at the embassy in 76, or 74 rather. But I came home and I was really bitter. And I think one of the reasons I managed to kind of keep it close and to myself was because 2 years later Dick and I were married, and so we had friends and had stayed in the military who had had similar experiences or simply experiences in Vietnam, so that when we talked with them about it, we could vent. But they were the only people we talked to. Because no one else could really understand. And of course, at the time, the political situation here in the United States and the hatred of the soldiers and the dwelling on only the bad parts was so pervasive. You didn't want to talk about it. You didn't want people to know you had been over there. I came home during the weekend it was, and the first weekend was the 4th of July. I was laying in my hammock in the backyard when the kid next door set off an ash can, which was a big, I rolled out of the hammock onto the ground, put my hands over my head. My mother opened the kitchen door laughing and said, "You don't need to do that now, dear, you're home." And I might have been home, but my mind was somewhere else. Physically I was home, but my mind was elsewhere. There was one other thing that just flashed through my mind, but that's okay. It'll come back.
Did you keep in touch with the other nurses that you served when you talked about you guys being kind of a close-knit group?
Yes. I lived in a hooch with 12 other women, and one of them was there for 3 months. We overlapped. I got there in June, July, August, September. 3.5 months. She went home in October, and she and I have been sisters ever since. She's like my sister. We are very close. We're godparents to her children, to some of her children. And she was the one I called at 4 o'clock in the morning when I was worried about our oldest daughter getting married to Steve. She was the one I had called at 2 o'clock in the morning when I couldn't sleep because I was worried about our younger daughter making the decision to live with her boyfriend. I know it's done all the time, but so anyway, she and I are very close. And 40 years with someone you only saw for 3 months, gosh, the glue is very solid. Very solid.
You talked earlier about how Vietnam kind of changed the way you view politics. Do you think your time there changed the way you view other values as well as roles as being a nurse kind of?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. If you, for anyone who has lived outside of the country, outside of the United States, in a country that, if not torn by war, at least certainly torn by their economy and culture, like in Korea, you get a tremendous appreciation for what you do have. And it seems like a small thing. I had to have my mother send me makeup. That was a big thing. Because I just couldn't go down to the grocery store and, buy the makeup. However, every day I was in the service, my dad flew the flag. He put up a flagpole when I had gotten my orders for Vietnam. And at every house he and my stepmother had after that, because my mom died after our oldest daughter was born, he flew that flag every day. And he never talked about the war to my brother, but he did to Dick. And towards the end of his life, he talked about it with me. And I have a real appreciation for what it means to take care of someone who is so desperately ill that their lives literally depend upon you and the decisions that you make. It affected my entire nursing career from the perspective of, well, I don't have this, so what can I do in order to jerry-rig it, kind of. We used to talk about cannibalizing in the military, and cannibalizing simply meant taking one part from one thing and moving it to another thing and making it work. And we did that all the time. Ingenuity, as far as nursing is concerned, I stayed in the military. I wasn't planning on doing that. I was planning on getting out. But Dick and I had gotten married, and when my 3 years my nursing career, yes. The lessons I learned in Vietnam, the experiences that I had, the compassion that I developed for my craft and for patients has never left me. Although I think I had the empathy inside all along, but certainly that year in Vietnam helped bring it out. You can teach skills, you can teach lots of skills, but you can't teach empathy. You either got it or you don't. Excuse me. But I have never regretted going. I didn't want to go. I was afraid. Here I am at 23 making out a will thinking, oy, maybe I won't come back because nurses were killed in Vietnam. So it was a serious thing. But I will always be grateful for that opportunity. As I said earlier, as I reflect back on the 40 years that I've been a nurse, that was the zenith of my nursing career in terms of compressing emotions, compressing the need for my skills and the need to learn and my eagerness in learning. Even though I went on and had a very successful career in the military and had many other positions which were wonderful, that year was special, was very special.
So in retrospect, when you look back to the politics that were kind of going on in America, do you think that now they've changed a lot with how American civilians view veterans, or do you think still needs to be worked on, kind of?
Oh, always, because there is greed everywhere, and there are people who choose to place themselves before others. That's just who we are in many ways, unfortunately, or who many people are. Now, I'm not saying, give away all your treasures and move to a nunnery, because I love the little luxuries that I have. Do I spoil my granddaughter? Oh yeah, you bet. Did I spoil our daughters? I tried hard to. Probably not when they were growing up, but now. You don't have to buy me anything else. Okay, I won't. And then I go down to Anthropology and sweep the store. But that's why I worked hard, was so that I could do things. But giving back, whether it be in your church or in your community, or to your fellow students, from my perspective, there's no place for incivility. And you see it all the time on television, and even when you go to open forums. We've just had an election, open forums here in Chapel Hill for school board and for the town council. People just shout right over others, and the ability to listen, take in, and then respond is gone in many, many ways. but I've gotten off the track here. No, I haven't. My family, our family, my husband and I, are tremendously proud of our country and of our service in it, as are our children. Our daughter and granddaughter called us on Veterans Day to wish us a happy Veterans Day. Now Elizabeth is 4.5. She has no concept. But it was neat. And Katie does that every year. Our oldest daughter was born in a military hospital, was schooled through Department of Defense schools all the way up through high school, and graduated from a military Department of Defense high school. Christina, our younger daughter, was born also while I was on active duty, but I retired when she was in the 7th grade. So she had 1 year in middle school in civilian life outside of the Department of Defense schools, and then she went to Chapel Hill High School here and graduated from Chapel Hill. And the kids that she hung around with in high school impressed both Dick and I a lot, because they seemed to also understand what our values and what our values were. They were always coming to the house. She sang with the choir. She did a lot of stuff with our church, and was busy in drama and plays and stuff like that. And the kids would always come here. I mean, they'd pile in with sleeping bags. They'd make their own pizzas. Dick would fry up chicken, whatever. And then the following morning we'd make them breakfast and they'd all go home. They knew what our rules were. No drugs, no booze. But we never had a problem leaving them. And that kind of leaving them alone. And those values don't, that way of life is a wonderful way to be when you don't need to fear your children or your children's friends. And I think part of the military process for all of us was that kind of trust. I'm not saying that the military doesn't have their corruption, their politics, and all of the other kinds of traits that you see in the civilian world. At the same time, there's something very different about being on active duty or being a veteran, and I think many of those traits came to both Dick and I through our families and how we raised our children. I know they're proud of us, as we are of them. It's a difficult political climate right now, very difficult. And we're much more conservative than liberal. But that doesn't mean that we're not ready to do our part and share, much like what our families did when we were growing up. I don't know if that makes any sense. Does that make any sense?
Well, I guess that's it. And we just
Okay.
want to thank you
You're welcome.
for taking your time up to let us interview you. And I think you had really great insight, and I liked listening to what you had to say.
Thank you. I have one other story that I had meant to tell when we were in your high school class. And I think it might explain a lot. Or maybe I told you and I just don't remember. So if I'm having a senior moment. When I was at the third field, I worked a lot. Well, I worked a lot of nights anyway. But one night, I was sitting behind the nurse's desk, and the desk was kind of low, and then it had this raised thing on top of it, so you could, sort of lean over, kind of like a countertop, I guess. And two of our corpsmen were talking. One was a very wizened staff sergeant, Sergeant Crumble. He was a black man, had been in the field his entire year, probably had been in some really life-threatening situations. And he had come in from the field for his last 3-4 weeks in country, so he could make some transitions. And the other one was Specialist Denson. Specialist Denson looked like Howdy Doody. He really did. Again, another freckled face, red-headed. I seem to be running into them a lot. But Denson was getting ready to go home in a day or two. And he was telling Sergeant Crumble what he was going to do, telling Crumble and me what he was going to do when he went home. He was going to go down to the VFW, drink those beers, tell those war stories to those old vets. And Crumble listened and nodded, and he said something I've never forgotten. He looked at Benson and said, sometimes the best war stories are the ones that are never told. And I think that